Last week, I wrote an essay on where one might encounter sacred spaces during the Viking Age for Norse polytheists. I framed this on Instagram. I asked the question of, did people in the Viking Age worship in temples or not? And the answers were very interesting. It was almost a 50-50 split in the end of people saying yes, they did, and no, they didn't. And actually, this essay that I wrote ended up being quite long and looked at a much broader sense of how can we define a sacred space for people in Scandinavia, as well as focusing on some other areas before the arrival of Christianity, so for Norse polytheists. Now, if you look up a definition of the sacred space or a sacred space online today, if you look at, say, encyclopedia.com, very interesting entry with lots of different examples across religions, but a lot of the time in other places you'll find references made to how every home should have a sacred space, or that, for example, your desk should be a sacred space in that way. And while that's certainly an interpretation of what that can mean, and I don't mean to take away from that in any way, of course, a sacred space is a very subjective term. It can mean different things to a lot of different people, and that's something that we should keep in mind. What I'm referring to here, what I have defined it as, is a space in which rituals are performed, a place at which beings of a supernatural or otherworldly nature can be contacted and communicated with, and which have certain rules ascribed to them due to these connections with the sacred or with otherworldly beings. And I think this is a rather broad definition, and that's because we don't really know an incredibly large amount about the Viking Age sacred spaces and how people will have viewed them, while we do know a lot more about modern religions and how they view them. So some modern examples for this, of course, a place where you can contact the divine or are close to the divine, where rituals are performed and where certain rules are ascribed. According to this definition that I have given here, a church would count as a sacred space. It's where Christians go to conduct the Mass. There are certain rules attached, like you can't enter a church while dressed in a certain way in many countries. There are certain things that you can and can't do in certain areas, and it is believed in a church that you have a direct line to God, although of course, depending on denomination and version and different people's own beliefs, there can be variance within this, and obviously Christianity isn't one whole. There are many different variations within that as well. You could, of course, take this a little bit further and then argue that some people have shrines in their own home. For example, many Hindus will have a shrine containing a murti in their house and that they perform rituals at as well. So it's not just religious buildings. And I think by first looking at this modern example, while we shouldn't sort of have what we have today, modern examples, and directly transmit that into the past, because that can create a lot of problems, it's a good place to start, because even by looking at modern examples, we can see there are variations between what some people consider sacred and what others don't. Now, one interesting caveat to this is when people perform a mass or, say, a prayer before a meal. So, for example, in Christianity, when Catholicism a lot of the time became illegal, so say in England, and you had the priest holes where priests would come to conduct mass for wealthy families, they'd often have to hide them because that was illegal at one point in this country. It's very interesting that then the mass could be performed there, that they could be blessed, and that then sort of transformed that space into a sacred space as well while the mass was being done, because essentially that is a ritual, that's a ceremony that's being performed in a space. But of course, normally the home of this wealthy aristocrat wouldn't be considered a particularly sacred space. So it's not necessarily just a physical space that we're talking about here. Places can be both secular and religious, and that's just a modern example. And actually for the Viking Age, we'll probably find a lot more examples of where spaces can be both sacred or religious in nature and secular in nature too. So somewhere that most people will start, and I think some of the messages I got after I asked about temples and whether people will have worshipped in them or not during the Viking Age was saying, well, of course they did. Have you not read Adam of Bremen? Have you not looked at Thietmar of Merseberg? They both describe temples, or the Icelandic Sagas. And this is very true, they do, but what we need to remember about Adam of Bremen and about Thietmar of Merseberg is that they actually never saw the temples that they describe. Thietmar doesn't actually describe a temple either. He describes a religious ceremony at Lejre in Denmark, but he never actually went there, and we don't know if there was some kind of structure there or not. Adam certainly does. It's through him that we get the description of the temple at Uppsala in Sweden, but it's important to remember that these were both Christians, they both had not seen these temples themselves, and actually at the time of writing, it's quite likely that these had already been destroyed. So these were things that had been around in the past, but then that they got second, or I think third hand is more likely, from these sources. And there is even debate as to whether Adam of Bremen is actually describing a temple of Norse polytheists, or whether this was a different denomination of church. Now, I'm not sure if there's enough evidence to support this argument, but I'll link that article down below. It's a really interesting one to look into if you have time. But there are several problems with the descriptions there, not least that actually some of the gods being described in the temple aren't actually the names of Norse gods. So the god statues that he describes are Thor, who is a Norse god, but also Fricko and Woden. And actually there are some very interesting studies that have been done into the two names that are being given there, because people just jump and assume that these are Freyr and Odin, the Norse gods. But there is actually very good evidence to suggest that such a leap shouldn't be made uncritically. But I'll leave that in the description below. If that sounds like something you're interested in, I can do a proper video looking at that as well. But essentially there are great problems with the sources that have been given to us. Several Icelandic sagas, which were written several hundred years after the end of the Viking Age, also describe these temples. Now, the word that they use in Old Norse is hof, and this will be brought back up later as well in conjunction with some of the studies that have been done into it. But normally this was assumed to mean something like temple. Now, Adam of Bremen, when he was describing Uppsala, was writing in Latin, and he used the term templum to mean temple, and that's obviously relating to what the Romans built back in the day as well, and that's where we get that term from. The fullest and most detailed description from the sagas of a temple comes from the late 13th century Byggja saga. And in this one we get a really full description of a hof, which is described as sacred and inviolate, and that further into the hof there was a house in the same kind as is now the choir in a church, and on the altar lay a seamless ring weighing 20 aurar, on which oaths were sworn. Now I'm going to continue to quote this passage, but I want to keep in mind several things while I'm reading this. One of these is the comparisons to Christian ceremonies and Christian buildings. Now in the bit that I just read, you already heard that he compares part of this hof directly to the choir in a church. And there are many others, and see if you can spot them while I'm going through. You've also got the altar and a ring on the altar, just as in a Christian church you have the altar where Mass is conducted. This ring, the hofgoði, was to wear at all gatherings of men. Now hofgoði, I'll just quickly interrupt there, is made up of the words hof, so again temple, and goði is some kind of, originally a religious leader, but later goði becomes synonymous with some kind of chieftain. So the compound together there we assume is something like temple priest, temple leader, that kind of thing. So this ring, the hofgoði, was to wear at all gatherings of men. On the statli there should also stand a bowl for sacrificial blood, and in it a blood twig like an aspergillium. And with this one should sprinkle from the bowl that blood which was called hlaut. This was the blood from the killing of those animals which were sacrificed to the gods. Around the statli, the gods were arranged in the annex. So this is a very interesting passage, and it gives a very full description, but there are some points that we should be aware of. Now, this passage, as well as the one given by Thietmar of Merseberg and Adam of Bremen in conjunction to the sacrificial site at Lere in Denmark and the temple at Uppsala, all have some things in common, and it's possible that they were actually looking at each other's work to inspire each other for how they were going to describe. Because remember, during the times when they were writing, not so much in the case of Thietmar, he was writing in the 10th century, Adam was writing towards the end of the 11th century, in the 1070s. So by this time, really, the majority of these sites had been destroyed already. Certainly in Iceland, by the time that this passage was written down there, the last temples will have been destroyed around 300 years ago. Because let's not forget that temples, if they did exist, these buildings of religious worship, would be the first place to be targeted by Christian evangelists. And actually, in a lot of the sagas, that's exactly what we read that happens. These great Christianizing kings like Olaf Tryggvason, the first thing that they do is destroy the idols, burn the temples, kill the priests. So these would be the first bits of visual Norse polytheism to disappear. So one of the things to be aware of about this description in particular are again the comparisons made with Christian ceremony and Christian buildings. And actually a lot of the descriptions may actually find parallels in the Old Testament, which they all would have read, all of these writers. Remember, the first two were churchmen, and the third would likely had some connection to a church if he were a scribe, as is likely. And these all have connections with how religious houses of pagans in the Middle East were described in the Old Testament. But again, in a point I made in a previous video about the terms we use to describe these people, just because they're also called pagan doesn't mean they have anything in common with the people that are being described in Scandinavia and the North Atlantic during the Viking Age. They don't have probably anything in common with peoples of a non-doctrinal religion in the Near or Middle East during the 1st century AD. So there may also be elements of what I termed heathenizing the Christian. And this is actually something that Jackson Crawford said in his video, which is really good. I'd highly recommend it, and I will link below on aspects of Norse religion. And he said that actually this account sounds an awful lot like imagining what a current Catholic ceremony would be like, but what if they were kind of rock and roll? And I think that's a very good way of describing it, because if you think, how would someone in the Middle Ages, who for hundreds of years would not have seen some kind of ceremony like this taking place, how would you then imagine one to go? Well, you'd probably base it on a Christian ceremony, but think, what are pagans like? They like blood, and instead of having an aspergillium, you'd use a twig. And you know, rings are kind of cool and kind of old school. They'd probably have one of those. Although in terms of the ring, there is some evidence to suggest that actually rings were used in oaths, and other parts of Adam of Bremen's descriptions can actually be verified, but I'll get onto that a little bit later on. So this was essentially, in early scholarship, these accounts were taken much more at face value and not criticized as heavily as I've done now, and as scholarship tends to do today. That's not to say that they don't have a value in and of themselves, and I'm certain that there are particular details within them that are valid and that come from a true tradition, but that perhaps quite a lot of the gaps that were there, some of the details you can find parallels to in the Old Testament and in the other accounts. So I think it's likely that some of the details may have been filled in when they didn't have actual information on what these cultic practices were like. So to come back to the term Hof, it was for a long time believed that the account in, I believe it's Landnámabók, one of the Icelandic accounts of the taking, the settlement of Iceland, that each district in Iceland had its own temple, or its own Hof, as it was referred to. And a lot of place names in Iceland today have this form Hof in the name. For example, Hofstaðir is the Hof place. And this was taken for a long time to be the case, that there will have been these kind of great big temple structures there. But this was challenged in 1966 by a Danish archaeologist and historian, Olaf Olsen. And he, in his thesis from that year, he wrote about the Hof and actually did archaeological excavations at these sites. And his conclusion was that there was no real evidence to base this assertion on, that each Hof place name was home to a temple during the Viking Age. And he actually found that there was no real evidence for specific and separate religious buildings at these places, the only one of which might be referred to as a religious building would be the Hurgur. And this term is actually denoting a kind of a pile of rocks that then may have had an altar placed on top of it, a kind of idol that was then worshipped, but nothing like these great big pillared temples that we read about in the Icelandic Sagas and in the earlier accounts from churchmen as well. So Olsen's conclusions really call into question this idea that there were such temple structures in Iceland, and then presumably also in Scandinavia as well, and that Hof, which is the religious building word, or that's what we thought beforehand, actually connoted some kind of big building of religious worship, and that maybe we should be looking for completely different things when it comes to worship. And this might stand to reason because, well, what do we have around today? What did those scribes and authors in the Middle Ages writing down have, they had the Christian model, which certainly did include buildings like monasteries, cathedrals, churches. But is that just them superimposing their idea of the sacred space back for what people beforehand will have viewed as a sacred space? And actually, if you go way back and you read Tacitus, who obviously wrote Germania, in there he actually says that the Germanic peoples do not consider it consistent with the grandeur of celestial beings to confine the gods within walls, or to liken them to the form of any human countenance. They consecrate woods and groves, and they apply the names of deities to the abstraction which they see only in spiritual worship. Now, of course, this goes back to the 1st century AD, and obviously religions change and things develop over time, but it might be the case, and this is following on from Olson's research, that actually a lot of sacred spaces could have been outside, that they were not particular buildings as we might interpret now, but that they were outdoor and natural locations. And actually we see this back in a lot of place names from Scandinavia. So we might think of places like mountains and hills, which come across as fjall in Icelandic, or fjall, and berg, groves, which are connoted with the place name Lundur, meadows and arable fields like Vangar and Akker, islands like Oi or E, lakes, so Sjur and Seir, rivers, or and springs, but also funeral barrels, so hauger. These places are important because if they're being denoted in place names, a lot of the time they're not just being, they don't just have this place name element that denotes what kind of natural site it is, but it's connected then to another word to suggest that it is a holy site. So an example is Helgafjell in Iceland, or Helgafjell in Icelandic, and this denotes the Helga is actually from the same root as English holy. So this is the holy mountain. And in Sweden you have the Oklunda, and this again denotes that it's a sacred kind of grove. And this is very interesting because a lot of the time at such sites you don't get a building to denote that it's a sacred place, but rather you get additions that are added to it. So like stone settings in the form of ships, which had its own label attached to it, the skeið in Old Norse, or circles and raised stones, which were sometimes inscribed with runes, which come across as kumbul or merke. And these are very interesting because it does again suggest that we should be looking for something different to the kind of Christian model of a sacred space. And perhaps this is exactly what we should expect from a religion like Norse polytheism, if it can even be referred as a religion, because it's non-doctrinal in its belief set. So while Christianity is doctrinal, there are certain tenets that a building has to fulfill, a place has to fulfill before it can be a church, a monastery, a cathedral. It's not so much the case for this belief set. And actually a lot of the time when we're thinking about Norse polytheists, we're thinking of, and indeed the name Norse polytheist, this may be an argument against the point that I was supporting in the last of these vlog videos, is that they didn't just worship gods. We tend to think of this religion as being very much one of the worship of Thor, or of Odin, or Frey or Freya. But actually a lot of the time, when in actual fact the veneration and respect given to non-divine beings that weren't gods, or I should say non-deities. So for example, the Disir, which are these female spirits, or sometimes considered deities, which are associated with fate, or the Álfar, which are the supernatural kind of beings of a lower rank that are related to the Vanir gods, and possibly also, most importantly, the Landvættir, so the spirits of the land. These may actually have been as important, if not more important, for the majority of poor people who were very much bound to the land. But because it was the religion of, let's say, the aristocracy, the kings, who had more means and who would be more, it's a term that we use, called archaeologically visible. So how can we actually see it in archaeological evidence that these were the ones that mostly worshipped the gods as we know them, whereas the common people quite possibly were more tied to these lesser forms of deities, because for them it was more important if the harvest succeeded, or if their animals got sick, rather than these kind of really big cosmic forces and good fortune in war, and that you become famous. For a lot of different people, it meant different things. That isn't to say that these aren't actually very much connected, because of course Freyr is a fertility god. Thor actually is also a fertility god. If you read into him, they often say prayers to Thor, and we have things surviving to us. He's a god of the rain, of course. If we think he's the personification of thunder, thunder brings the rain makes the crops grow, so he's also connected with fertility. So that's not to say that the kind of common gods weren't important to people on the land either, but it's something that should be considered. And the reason why I've explained all this is because that might also explain why a lot of these sacred places might be outside in the open air, if they are indeed targeted at such spirits like the land spirits, like the elves, like the Disir. It's not some kind of external deity, some kind of cosmic force, but something that's much more implicit and built into the landscape.